3 nannies stood outside the nursery door of the Castellan estate, none of them willing to go back inside. 4-year-old Ezra Castellan had been crying, without meaningful pause, for nearly 60 hours. 2 pediatricians had examined him. A child psychologist had been flown in overnight. Nothing worked. The house, usually silent and enormous and carefully managed, had become unbearable, every hallway carrying the same thin, exhausted wail. Downstairs in the estate's private garage, Sawyer Holt knelt beside a stalled vintage roadster he'd been called out to repair. Close enough to hear the crying drift faintly through the ceiling. Close enough that something in his chest had been tightening with every hour it continued. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the family. He fixed cars. That was the entire scope of what he'd been hired to do tonight. But when Julian Castellan appeared in the garage doorway at 11 at night, hollow-eyed, undone in a way no amount of money had ever prepared him for, and asked, almost desperately, whether Sawyer had kids of his own, something in Sawyer's chest told him this conversation was about to become bigger than a broken engine. He had no idea that in the next 20 minutes, he was going to say 4 words to a grieving child that nobody else in that house, not the doctors, not the nannies, not even Julian himself, had any way of knowing. If you believe grief sometimes needs a stranger, not an expert, to finally reach it, stay with me, because tonight proves exactly that. Subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes. Sawyer was 34, a single father for 2 years, raising his daughter Wren alone since his wife Marisol died suddenly of an aneurysm, gone without warning between one ordinary evening and the next. He ran a small independent auto shop, specializing, almost by accident, in vintage restorations, which was the only reason a household as wealthy as the Castellans had ever called him at all. He knew grief in a specific, unglamorous way. Most of the people in this mansion had never had to learn it. He knew what it looked like on a 2-year-old's face when the parent who used to sing her to sleep simply stopped existing one day, and no explanation a grown adult could offer would ever make sense of that absence to a small child. Remember that Wren was 2 when her mother died. That detail matters more than it seems right now. "My wife," Julian said, standing in the garage doorway, his voice cracking in a way Sawyer suspected this man hadn't allowed himself in front of another human being in days. "She died 3 days ago, car accident. Ezra was in the back seat. He wasn't hurt, not physically, but he saw it happen, and since then he won't stop. Nothing works. I don't know what to do anymore." Sawyer set down his wrench slowly. "I'm sorry, I truly am, but I'm not sure what you think I can do that a psychologist couldn't." "I don't know either," Julian admitted. "I just heard you telling one of the staff earlier that you lost your own wife. I don't know why, but I thought maybe, I don't know. I'm not thinking clearly right now." Sawyer looked at this man, stripped of every advantage his wealth had ever given him, standing in a garage asking a mechanic for help because nothing else had worked. "Can I see him?" Sawyer asked quietly. "I can't promise anything." The nursery was dim, lit only by a small nightlight shaped like a moon, and Ezra sat curled in the corner of his crib, his small body shaking with the particular exhausted, rhythmic crying of a child who has been at this far too long to fully understand why he can't stop. Sawyer stood in the doorway for a moment, not approaching, simply looking, the way he'd learned to look at his own daughter in her worst moments, letting the room tell him something before he moved. That's when he saw it. A mobile hanging above the crib, hand-painted wooden shapes turning slowly on threads, stars and moons, and one small yellow bumblebee positioned slightly apart from the others. Something in Sawyer's chest went very still. "Who made that mobile?" he asked quietly, not taking his eyes off it. Julian, standing behind him, frowned. "My wife did. Handmade, she said it was important to her." "Why?" Sawyer didn't answer right away. He was doing math in his head, counting years, counting a name he hadn't let himself think about in a very long time. Before we go any further, it matters to understand what Sawyer recognized in that mobile, because the answer traces back 16 years, to a version of his life nobody in this house had any reason to know about. 16 years earlier, before Wren, before Marisol, a much younger Sawyer had briefly dated a woman named Celeste during 2 years of art school neither of them ended up finishing. Celeste had loved wooden mobiles, had made dozens of them as a hobby, always with one small bumblebee tucked slightly apart from the rest of the shapes. A private joke between the two of them from a summer they'd spent volunteering at a bee sanctuary the year they met. She used to hum a specific, wordless tune whenever she strung a new mobile together, a habit Sawyer had teased her about constantly, one he still occasionally caught himself humming without meaning to, all these years later. whenever his hands were busy with careful, repetitive work. They drifted apart amicably after school. No dramatic ending, simply two young people whose paths diverged the way paths sometimes do. Sawyer had heard, years later, secondhand, that she'd married into money, changed her name slightly, become someone he no longer recognized in photographs. He had never once connected that woman to the name Castellan. Not until he saw a bumblebee, hand-painted, tucked apart from the other shapes on a dying child's mobile, exactly the way Celeste always used to make them. "What was your wife's name?" Sawyer asked quietly. "Before she married you?" "Celeste," Julian said. "Celeste Marchetti, why does that matter right now?" Sawyer closed his eyes for a moment. "I knew her," he said, "a long time ago, before either of us had any of this." Julian stared at him, uncertain what to do with that information in the middle of the worst week of his life. "She used to hum something," Sawyer said slowly, "whenever she made these, a specific tune. I haven't heard it in years, but I think I still remember it." Sawyer approached the crib carefully, crouching down to Ezra's eye level the same unhurried way he'd once calmed his own daughter through her hardest nights, and began very quietly to hum. It wasn't a real song. It never had been, not really, just a wandering, wordless melody Celeste had made up years ago, half-remembered now, imperfect in Sawyer's memory, but close enough. Ezra's crying didn't stop immediately, but it slowed, hitching, the exhausted rhythm of it breaking for the first time in 3 days. "That's Mommy's song," Ezra whispered, his voice raw and small. "How do you know Mommy's song?" Sawyer felt something crack open in his own chest, 16 years of forgotten memory colliding suddenly with the present moment. "I knew your mommy a long, long time ago," he said gently. "Before you were born, she used to hum that same tune while she made things with her hands, just like you're hearing it now." Ezra's crying finally stopped, replaced by a quiet, hiccuping stillness, his small hand reaching through the crib bars toward Sawyer's sleeve. "Is Mommy coming back?" he whispered. Sawyer felt the question land in the exact place grief always lands, no matter how much money surrounds you, no matter how many doctors have already tried to answer it. "No, buddy," he said softly. "She's not. I'm so sorry. But that song, that bumblebee up there, that was something she made just for you, out of something she loved a long time ago. It means she was thinking about you even before you existed. That's a pretty big thing to carry with you." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his small fingers still curled around Sawyer's sleeve. "Will you sing it again?" he asked. Sawyer hummed it a second time, softer. And this time Ezra's eyes began to close, exhaustion finally winning out over grief. 3 days of crying finally settling into something like rest. Julian stood in the doorway, watching his son sleep for the first time in 3 days. Tears running freely down his own face now, no longer holding anything back in front of a stranger who had somehow just become something else entirely. "I don't understand what just happened," he said quietly once they'd stepped into the hallway. 3 days, nothing worked, and you knew my wife 16 years ago, and somehow that's the thing that finally reached him." "I think he just needed to hear something that felt like her," Sawyer said. "Not an explanation, not a stranger trying to fix him, just something real that connected back to who she actually was." "How did you know to hum that? How did you even remember it?" Sawyer looked down at his own hands, grease still faintly worked into the creases of his knuckles. "Because I lost someone too. My wife 2 years ago. My daughter was younger than Ezra when it happened. I learned the hard way that grief doesn't listen to explanations. It listens to something familiar. I just got lucky that the familiar thing happened to still be sitting somewhere in my memory." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "I'd like you to meet my son properly when he's ready, not as the mechanic who fixed my car tonight. As someone who knew Celeste before any of this. I think someday he's going to want to know more about who she was before she was my wife. I think you might be the only person left who can tell him." Sawyer nodded slowly. "I'd like that too." Sawyer came back to the estate 3 weeks later, this time with Wren, who was almost exactly Ezra's age, both children still carrying the particular quiet weight of having lost a mother too early to fully understand it. He told Ezra, in small, careful pieces over several visits, stories about a young woman named Celeste who used to volunteer at a bee sanctuary, who loved making things with her hands, who once spent an entire afternoon trying and failing to teach Sawyer how to properly paint a wooden star. Ezra listened to every story like it was something precious, which, in a way, it was, a version of his mother that existed before wealth and mansions and marriages, a version only one person left alive could still describe to him. A year later, Julian established a small foundation in Celeste's memory. funding grief support programs specifically for young children who had lost a parent, built on the exact principle Sawyer had stumbled onto in that nursery. That healing rarely comes from expertise alone. Sometimes it comes from someone who simply still remembers who you loved and is willing to hand that memory back to you, piece by piece, for as long as it takes. He asked Sawyer to help design the program's approach. Sawyer agreed, on the condition that it never carry his name, the same quiet instinct that had led him into that nursery in the first place, wanting nothing beyond the chance to actually help. Ezra, older now, stood beside his father at the Foundation's first public event, holding a small wooden bumblebee Sawyer had carved for him, a twin to the one still hanging above his crib. "My mom made something for me before I was even born," he told the small crowd gathered, his child's voice carrying further than anyone expected. "And a man who barely knew us anymore remembered a song she used to hum, and it was the only thing that finally helped. I think that means love doesn't really go away. It just waits for the right person to carry it back to you." Sawyer, standing at the back of the room, felt Wren's small hand slip into his own, and thought, not for the first time, that grief had taught him more about showing up for people than anything else in his entire life ever had. Some things get lost for 16 years before they find their way back to exactly the person who needed them most. And some kindness doesn't require an expert at all. It just requires someone who happened to still remember the tune. If this one reached you, tell us in the comments about a small, familiar thing that once helped you through grief when nothing else could. Welcome to Heartverse. We're glad you're here.